What if I told you that in the darkest corners of Louisiana's history, two brothers became something far more terrifying than any ghost story you've ever heard? Before we dive into this blood-soaked tale of revenge and survival, make sure to subscribe to our channel, share this video with someone who loves intense historical stories, and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, because this story will shake you to your core. The year was 1844, and I was barely 16 when I witnessed what would forever change the course of my life and that of my older brother Malcolm. We were slaves on the Beauregard plantation, deep in the Louisiana bayou country, where the Spanish moss hung like funeral shrouds and the air itself seemed to carry the weight of human suffering. My name is Josiah, and this is the story of how my brother and I became the most feared killers in the entire South. Not by choice, but by necessity. The morning started like any other in that God-forsaken place. The overseer's bell clanged at 4:30, dragging us from our restless sleep in the cramped slave quarters. The wooden planks beneath us were damp with humidity and stained with decades of sweat, blood, and tears. Malcolm, 3 years my senior and built like a tree trunk from years of back-breaking labor, nudged me awake with his calloused hand. "Get up, little brother," he whispered, his voice carrying that familiar protective tone that had kept me alive through countless beatings and punishments. Another day in paradise. His sarcasm was our only defense against the crushing reality of our existence. We dressed quickly in our tattered clothes, the same ones we'd worn for months, patched and repatched until they were more thread than fabric. The other slaves around us moved like ghosts, their spirits broken by years of systematic brutality under Master Beauregard's iron fist. As we filed out into the pre-dawn darkness, I caught sight of something that made my blood run cold. 3 of our fellow slaves, old Samuel, young Marcus, and pregnant Lily, were nowhere to be seen. Their sleeping spots were empty, their few possessions scattered as if they'd been dragged away in the night. "Where are Samuel and the others?" I whispered to Malcolm as we joined the line, heading toward the cotton fields. His jaw tightened, and I saw something dangerous flicker in his dark eyes. "Don't know, but I got a bad feeling about this." The head overseer, a vicious man named Garrett with a face like a scarred bulldog, stood waiting for us with his usual arsenal of whips and chains. Behind him lurked his 2 most trusted enforcers, Pike, a mountain of a man with hands like ham hocks, and Crenshaw, whose smile never reached his cold blue eyes. "Listen up, you worthless pieces of property," Garrett bellowed, his voice cutting through the humid morning air like a rusty blade. "Today, we're gonna have ourselves a little demonstration, a reminder of what happens when slaves get ideas above their station." My stomach dropped as I realized what was coming. Malcolm's hand found mine, squeezing tight enough to cut off circulation. Around us, the other slaves began to murmur prayers under their breath, knowing that whatever was about to happen would haunt us for the rest of our lives. Garrett gestured toward the old oak tree that stood at the edge of the cotton field, the same tree where countless slaves had been whipped, tortured, and worse over the years. Its massive trunk was scarred with rope burns and stained dark with blood that had never fully washed away, even after the heaviest rains. "Bring them out!" Garrett shouted. Pike and Crenshaw disappeared into the tool shed, and moments later they emerged dragging 3 figures. My heart shattered as I recognized Samuel, Marcus, and Lily. They were barely conscious, their bodies bearing fresh wounds that spoke of a night filled with unimaginable torture. Samuel, who had taught me to read in secret using scraps of newspaper, could barely lift his gray head. Marcus, just 14 years old, whimpered like a wounded animal, and Lily, sweet Lily, who was carrying her first child. Her dress was torn and bloodied, her face swollen beyond recognition. "These 3 were caught planning an escape," Garrett announced, though we all knew it was a lie. "Samuel was too old to run, Marcus too young to plan anything, and Lily too pregnant to travel." This was simply another of Master Beauregard's periodic cullings, his way of keeping the rest of us in line through sheer terror. The penalty for attempting to steal Master Beauregard's property, which is what you are, don't forget, is death, Garrett continued, pulling out a long-barreled pistol that gleamed in the early morning light. I felt Malcolm's entire body tense beside me, his muscles coiling like a spring ready to snap. I knew that look in his eyes. It was the same expression he'd worn when he'd killed that water moccasin that had threatened me years ago. Cold, calculating, and absolutely lethal. The first shot echoed across the plantation like thunder. Samuel's body crumpled to the ground, his blood seeping into the red Louisiana clay. The second shot took young Marcus, whose final scream would echo in my nightmares for years to come. But it was the third shot, the one that ended Lily's life and that of her unborn child, that broke something fundamental inside both Malcolm and me. As her body fell, I heard my brother make a sound I'd never heard before, a low, animalistic growl that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his throat, somewhere primal and dangerous. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," Garrett said, holstering his weapon with casual indifference. "Master Beauregard's property stays on Master Beauregard's land. Anyone who thinks otherwise ends up feeding the worms." As the overseers walked away, laughing and joking about their morning's work, I looked around at my fellow slaves. Some were crying silently, others stared at the ground in defeat, but all of them wore the same expression of hopeless resignation that had defined our existence for as long as I could remember. All except Malcolm. When I looked at my brother, I saw something that terrified and thrilled me in equal measure. The gentle giant who had protected me, taught me, and loved me was gone. In his place stood something harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. "They're gonna pay for this," he whispered, his voice so low that only I could hear it. "Every last one of them is gonna pay." That night, as we lay in our bunks, listening to the sounds of the bayou, the splash of alligators, the call of night birds, the rustle of Spanish moss in the humid breeze, Malcolm began to plan. He spoke in whispers so quiet they were barely audible, outlining a campaign of revenge that would make the overseer's casual brutality look like child's play. "We're not just gonna kill them, Josiah," he said, his eyes reflecting the moonlight like a predator's. "We're gonna make them understand what it feels like to be hunted, to live in fear, to know that death is coming for them, and there ain't nothing they can do to stop it." As I listened to my brother's words, I felt something dark and terrible awakening inside me. The scared, obedient boy who had endured years of abuse was dying, replaced by something that would soon make grown men wake up screaming in the middle of the night. The blood of Samuel, Marcus, and Lily had watered the red Louisiana soil, but it had also planted the seeds of something far more dangerous than Master Beauregard or his overseers could possibly imagine. Tomorrow, the real nightmare would begin. 3 days had passed since the execution, and the plantation had settled back into its routine of systematic cruelty. But beneath the surface, something was stirring, something that would soon turn the Beauregard plantation into a hunting ground where the hunters became the hunted. I watched Malcolm during those 3 days, studying the way he moved, the way he observed everything around us with new eyes. He was cataloging weaknesses, memorizing patterns, and planning something that would change everything. The gentle brother I'd known was transforming into something else entirely, a weapon forged by years of oppression and sharpened by righteous fury. On the third night, as the overseers settled into their quarters after another day of brutality, Malcolm finally made his move. "Tonight, little brother," he whispered as we lay in our bunks, "tonight we start taking back what they stole from us." The overseer quarters were located in a separate building about 50 yards from the main house, close enough for the overseers to respond to any trouble from the slaves, but far enough away that Master Beauregard wouldn't be disturbed by their drunken revelry and violent entertainment. Garrett, Pike, and Crenshaw had spent the evening drinking corn whiskey and playing cards, their voices growing louder and more boisterous as the night wore on. They were celebrating their successful lesson from 3 days earlier, completely unaware that their victim's blood had awakened something far more dangerous than they could comprehend. At midnight, when the plantation had fallen into its deepest sleep, Malcolm and I slipped out of the slave quarters like shadows. Years of moving quietly to avoid beatings had taught us how to walk without making a sound, how to breathe without being heard, how to become invisible in plain sight. The moon was dark that night, hidden behind thick clouds that rolled in from the Gulf of Mexico. The only light came from the flickering candles in the overseer quarters, casting dancing shadows that would soon hide the most brutal violence the plantation had ever seen. Malcolm had spent those 3 days crafting weapons from the tools we used in the fields. A cotton hook had been sharpened into a curved blade that could open a man's throat in one swift motion. A broken piece of iron from a plow had been honed into a stabbing implement that could pierce flesh and bone with deadly efficiency. "Remember," Malcolm whispered as we approached the building, "we're not just killing them. We're sending a message. Every cut, every wound, every drop of blood has to tell a story." The overseer quarters consisted of 3 rooms connected by a narrow hallway. Garrett slept in the largest room at the end, while Pike and Crenshaw occupied the smaller chambers on either side. The building was old and poorly constructed, with gaps between the wooden planks that allowed us to peer inside and assess our targets. Pike was our first victim. The massive overseer lay sprawled across his bed, snoring like a freight train, his clothes reeking of whiskey and tobacco. His whip, the same one he'd used to flay the skin from countless slaves, hung from a peg on the wall, within easy reach of his sleeping form. Malcolm moved like death itself, sliding through Pike's window with the fluid grace of a predator. I followed, my heart pounding so hard I was certain it would wake our victim, but Pike continued to snore, lost in whatever drunken dreams occupied his twisted mind. My brother positioned himself beside the bed, the sharpened cotton hook gleaming in the dim candlelight. For a moment he hesitated, and I saw a flicker of the old Malcolm, the gentle soul who had sung me to sleep during the worst nights of our captivity. Then he remembered Lily's screams, Samuel's blood, Marcus's final breath, and the hesitation vanished. The cotton hook opened Pike's throat in one smooth motion, cutting so deep it nearly severed his head from his shoulders. Blood erupted like a crimson fountain, soaking the bed, the walls, and both of us in warm, sticky gore. Pike's eyes snapped open for just an instant, wide with shock and terror, before the light faded from them forever. But Malcolm wasn't finished. With methodical precision, he began carving symbols into Pike's massive chest, marks that looked like claw wounds from some enormous beast. He worked quickly but carefully, ensuring that anyone who found the body would see something that defied explanation. "What are you doing?" I whispered, horrified by the systematic mutilation. "Making them think we're something more than human," Malcolm replied, his voice eerily calm. "Fear is our greatest weapon now, Josiah. If they think we're monsters, they'll make mistakes. And when they make mistakes, we kill them." Crenshaw was next. The second overseer was a lighter sleeper, but years of drinking had dulled his reflexes. He stirred as we entered his room, but didn't fully wake until Malcolm's iron blade punched through his ribs and into his heart. Crenshaw's mouth opened to scream, but only blood emerged. His cold blue eyes, the same eyes that had watched Lily die with amusement, bulged with terror as he realized what was happening. Malcolm twisted the blade, ensuring maximum damage, then began the same ritualistic carving he'd performed on Pike. "Please," Crenshaw gurgled, somehow still clinging to life despite the massive wound in his chest. "Please, I got a family." "So did Lily," Malcolm replied, driving the blade deeper. "So did Samuel. So did Marcus." Crenshaw died with that knowledge burning in his eyes. Garrett proved to be our greatest challenge. The head overseer was a veteran of countless slave rebellions and Indian wars. Some primal instinct woke him just as we entered his room, and he rolled off his bed with surprising agility for such a large man. "What the hell?" he started to shout. But Malcolm was already moving. The two men crashed together in the center of the room, Garrett's superior size and experience battling against Malcolm's fury and desperation. They rolled across the floor, knocking over furniture and sending bottles crashing against the walls. Garrett managed to grab his pistol from the nightstand, but I was ready for him. The broken plow iron that Malcolm had given me found its mark, sliding between Garrett's ribs and puncturing his lung. He gasped, blood frothing from his mouth, but still tried to bring the weapon to bear. Malcolm ended it with the cotton hook, opening Garrett's throat just as he had Pike's. But this time, he didn't stop there. Years of accumulated rage poured out of him as he carved and slashed, turning Garrett's body into something that barely resembled human remains. When it was over, we stood in a room painted red with blood and gore. The three men who had terrorized us for years lay dead, their bodies bearing wounds that would puzzle investigators for decades to come. "Now what?" I asked, suddenly aware of the magnitude of what we'd done. Malcolm looked at me with eyes that seemed to glow in the candlelight. "Now we disappear into the bayou, and tomorrow night we find more of them." As we slipped back into the darkness, leaving behind a scene that would haunt the plantation for generations, I realized that my brother was right. We weren't just slaves anymore. We weren't even human anymore. We had become something far more dangerous. We had become the nightmare that would stalk the Louisiana bayou for the next year, leaving a trail of 47 bodies in our wake. The first 3 were just the beginning. The discovery of the 3 mutilated bodies sent shockwaves through the entire parish. I watched from the cotton fields as Master Beauregard himself emerged from the overseer quarters, his face pale as Spanish moss and his hands trembling like autumn leaves. The local sheriff, a fat man named Dubois who owed his position more to political connections than actual competence, arrived with a small posse of deputies. They spent hours examining the carnage, their voices growing more agitated with each passing minute. "Ain't never seen nothing like this," I heard one deputy mutter as he stumbled out of the building and vomited into the azalea bushes. "Looks like they was torn apart by some kind of wild animal." That was exactly what Malcolm had intended. Over the next week, as news of the massacre spread throughout Louisiana, the stories grew more elaborate and terrifying with each telling. Some claimed it was the work of a rogue alligator that had somehow learned to use tools. Others whispered about ancient Creole curses awakened by the spilled blood of innocents. But the most persistent rumor, the one that would eventually define our legend, spoke of 2 shadow men who moved through the bayou like vengeful spirits, marking their victims with claws that no earthly creature possessed. Malcolm and I had vanished into the swampland immediately after the killings, using knowledge passed down through generations of runaway slaves to navigate the treacherous waterways and hidden islands that dotted the Louisiana wetlands. We built a crude shelter on a small patch of dry land, surrounded by cypress trees and Spanish moss, invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. During the day, we remained hidden, observing the plantation from a distance and planning our next moves. At night, we became hunters. Our second target was a slave trader named Hutchins, who operated out of a ramshackle compound about 5 miles downriver from the Beauregard plantation. He specialized in breaking rebellious slaves through methods that made the overseer's cruelty look gentle by comparison. Hutchins kept his human merchandise in a series of wooden cages that were barely large enough for a grown person to lie down. The stench of human waste, rotting food, and despair hung over the compound like a physical presence, making my stomach churn even from our hiding spot in the nearby trees. 12 slaves in those cages, Malcolm whispered as we watched Hutchins make his evening rounds, all of them somebody's family, all of them suffering because men like him see profit in human misery. Hutchins was a careful man who had survived years in a dangerous business by never taking unnecessary risks. He employed 4 armed guards who worked in shifts, ensuring that someone was always awake and alert. His compound was surrounded by a wooden fence topped with sharpened stakes, and he kept a pack of hunting dogs that could track a man for miles through the swamp. But Malcolm had spent the week studying Hutchins' operation, learning his routines, identifying his weaknesses, and on a moonless night when the fog rolled in thick from the Gulf, we struck. The dogs were our first obstacle. These weren't pets or companions. They were weapons trained to hunt human beings, their natural instincts twisted into something monstrous by years of conditioning. Malcolm had prepared for them by collecting certain plants from the swamp, herbs that the old slaves had used to mask their scent during escape attempts. We approached the compound from downwind, our bodies coated with a mixture of mud and plant oils that made us invisible to the dogs' sensitive noses. The animals remained calm as we scaled the fence, completely unaware that death was walking among them. The first guard died without ever knowing we were there. Malcolm's cotton hook opened his throat as he sat smoking a pipe and reading a dime novel by lamplight. The man's blood splattered across the pages, mixing with the cheap ink to create patterns that looked almost artistic in the flickering light. The second guard proved more challenging. He was making his rounds when he discovered his partner's body, and his shout of alarm echoed across the compound like a church bell. But the fog muffled sound and confused direction, and by the time he realized where the danger was coming from, my plow iron was already sliding between his ribs. Hutchins emerged from his cabin with a shotgun in his hands and murder in his eyes. He was a veteran of countless violent encounters, and he moved with the confidence of a man who had never met an opponent he couldn't kill or intimidate. "Come out, you cowardly bastards!" he shouted into the fog. "Show yourselves and die like men!" Malcolm obliged him. My brother materialized from the mist like something out of a fever dream, his body covered in mud and blood, his eyes reflecting the lamplight like a wild animal's. The cotton hook in his hand gleamed wetly, and the ritualistic scars he'd carved into his own arms and chest made him look like some primitive war god risen from the swamp. Hutchins fired both barrels of his shotgun, but the fog and his own terror threw off his aim. The buckshot shredded the air where Malcolm had been standing, but my brother was already moving, circling around behind his target with the fluid grace of a predator. The slave trader tried to reload, but his hands were shaking too badly to manage the simple task. He dropped shells, fumbled with the breech, and cursed with increasing desperation as he realized that death was stalking him through the mist. Malcolm's attack came from behind, the cotton hook opening Hutchins' back from shoulder blade to hip. The slave trader screamed and spun around, swinging the empty shotgun like a club, but Malcolm was already gone, vanished back into the fog like a ghost. The psychological warfare continued for nearly an hour. Malcolm would appear just long enough to inflict another wound, then disappear before Hutchins could retaliate. Each cut was precisely placed to cause maximum pain without immediately killing, and each attack left the slave trader more terrified and disoriented. By the time Malcolm finally ended it, Hutchins was begging for mercy, promising money, freedom, anything if we would just make the nightmare stop. But mercy was a luxury we could no longer afford. The final guard tried to run when he saw what remained of his employer. He made it almost to the gate before my plow iron found his spine, dropping him face first into the mud where he bled out slowly, his fingers clawing uselessly at the earth. But our work wasn't finished. We spent the rest of the night freeing the slaves from their cages, giving them weapons and directions to safe houses operated by the Underground Railroad. Most were too weak or traumatized to travel far, but a few had enough strength left to make the journey north to freedom. Before we left, Malcolm performed his ritualistic carving on all 4 bodies, creating wounds that looked like the work of some enormous beast. He also left behind other signs, strange symbols scratched into the wooden walls, arrangements of bones and feathers that suggested occult practices, anything that would add to the growing legend of the Shadow Men. As dawn broke over the compound, we melted back into the swamp, leaving behind a scene that would fuel nightmares throughout the parish. 4 more bodies added to our count, 4 more messages sent to those who profited from human suffering. But more importantly, we had freed 12 souls from bondage, giving them a chance at the life that had been stolen from them. That knowledge burned bright in my chest, a warm flame that helped push back the darkness that was slowly consuming my soul. The newspapers called it the work of savage beasts and inhuman monsters. The local authorities posted rewards for information about the creatures responsible for the killings. Plantation owners began hiring additional guards and building higher fences, but none of them understood the truth that we weren't monsters at all. We were simply men who had been pushed beyond the breaking point, transformed by systematic cruelty into something that could fight back against the machine of oppression. And we were just getting started. Word of our activities had spread far beyond the parish boundaries, carried by terrified whispers and sensationalized newspaper accounts that painted us as everything from escaped circus animals to demons summoned by voodoo practitioners. The truth, as always, was both simpler and more terrifying than any of the wild theories circulating through the drawing rooms and taverns of Louisiana society. Master Beauregard, his plantation now operating with a skeleton crew of overseers imported from other states, had joined forces with neighboring plantation owners to form what they grandly called the Parish Defense Committee. In reality, it was nothing more than a collection of frightened men with too much money and too little courage, willing to pay others to solve a problem they couldn't understand. The solution they settled on was a group of professional slave hunters, led by a man named Captain Ezra Blackwood, a former military officer who had made his fortune tracking down runaway slaves throughout the Deep South. Blackwood was everything the plantation owners weren't: competent, experienced, and utterly without conscience. I watched from our hidden position in the cypress trees as Blackwood and his men arrived at the Beauregard plantation. There were 8 of them in total, all mounted on fine horses and armed with the latest rifles and pistols. They moved with the disciplined precision of soldiers, their eyes constantly scanning the tree line for signs of danger. Blackwood himself was a tall, lean man with graying hair and cold grey eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. He wore a Confederate officer's uniform, though the war wouldn't begin for another 17 years, and carried himself with the arrogant confidence of someone who had never failed to bring back his quarry, dead or alive. "Gentlemen," I heard him address the assembled plantation owners, his voice carrying clearly across the water. "I've been hunting runaway slaves for 15 years, and I've never failed to complete a contract. These creatures that have been terrorizing your properties are nothing more than a couple of particularly clever runaways who've gotten lucky. That luck ends today." Malcolm, crouched beside me in the mud and Spanish moss, made a sound that was half laugh and half growl. "Lucky," he whispered. "Let's see how lucky he feels when we're done with him." Over the past month, my brother had changed in ways that both thrilled and terrified me. The systematic violence we'd been inflicting had awakened something primal in him, something that seemed to feed on blood and fear. He'd begun decorating his body with ritual scars, marking each kill with a new wound that he carved into his own flesh. His eyes had taken on a predatory gleam that never seemed to fade, and he moved through the swamp with an inhuman grace that made even the alligators give him a wide berth. I was changing too, though I tried not to think about it. The scared boy who had watched Samuel, Marcus, and Lily die was gone, replaced by something harder and more ruthless. I'd learned to kill without hesitation, to inflict pain without remorse, to see our enemies not as human beings, but as obstacles to be removed. Blackwood's plan was methodical and professional. He divided his men into 3 teams of 2, with himself and his lieutenant forming the 4th team. They would sweep through the swamp in a coordinated pattern, using tracking dogs and local guides to flush us out of hiding. Once we were located, they would close in from multiple directions, cutting off any escape routes. It was a good plan. It might even have worked against ordinary runaway slaves, but we weren't ordinary anymore. The first team consisted of 2 brothers named Garrett and Samuel Hutchins, relatives of the slave trader we'd killed the previous month. They were motivated by revenge as much as money, which made them dangerous but also predictable. Grief and anger clouded judgment, and clouded judgment led to mistakes. We found them on the 2nd day of their hunt, following a false trail that Malcolm had laid, using techniques learned from escaped slaves who had successfully evaded capture for years. The brothers were moving through a narrow channel between 2 islands, their attention focused on the muddy ground where we'd left carefully placed footprints. Malcolm struck from above, dropping from a cypress branch like a hunting spider. His cotton hook opened the younger brother's throat before the man could even cry out, sending a spray of arterial blood across the dark water. The older brother spun around, raising his rifle, but I was already behind him, my plow iron sliding between his ribs and into his heart. But this time, we didn't just kill them and leave. Malcolm had developed a new strategy, one designed to maximize the psychological impact of our attacks. We stripped the bodies and hung them from the cypress branches, positioning them so they would be clearly visible to anyone following the same trail. Then Malcolm performed his ritualistic carving, creating wounds that looked like the work of some enormous predator. Finally, we arranged the men's weapons and equipment in strange patterns around the base of the tree, creating a scene that suggested occult practices. The second team found their colleagues 3 hours later. I watched from concealment as the 2 men stared up at the hanging corpses, their faces pale with shock and terror. One of them vomited into the swamp water, while the other began muttering prayers in what sounded like Latin. "Jesus Christ," one of them whispered. "What kind of animals are we dealing with?" "Not animals," his partner replied, his voice shaking. "Something worse." They retreated immediately, abandoning their search to report back to Blackwood, but we weren't finished with them yet. Malcolm and I followed the fleeing hunters through the swamp, staying just out of sight, but making sure they knew they were being pursued. We snapped branches, disturbed the water, and occasionally allowed them to catch glimpses of movement in their peripheral vision. By the time they reached the main camp, they were jumping at shadows and firing at every sound. The third team lasted slightly longer, but only because they were more experienced. These were professional bounty hunters who had tracked dangerous men through some of the most hostile terrain in North America. They moved carefully, watched each other's backs, and never allowed themselves to be separated. But experience could only take them so far against opponents who knew the swamp like their own heartbeat. We attacked them during the night, when the fog rolled in thick and the sounds of the bayou masked our approach. Malcolm took the first man with his cotton hook, opening his throat while he stood guard duty. I killed the second with my plow iron as he slept, driving the sharpened metal through his skull and into his brain. These bodies we left where they fell, but not before Malcolm performed his ritualistic mutilation. The wounds he carved were getting more elaborate, more artistic, as if he was developing his own twisted form of expression through violence. By the 4th day, Blackwood was down to just himself and his lieutenant, a nervous young man named Morrison who kept glancing over his shoulder as if expecting death to materialize from the Spanish moss. The professional confidence that had characterized their arrival was gone, replaced by the hunted look of men who had finally encountered something beyond their understanding. "Sir," Morrison said as they made camp on a small island that offered clear sightlines in all directions, "maybe we should consider withdrawing. regrouping with additional men. Blackwood's response was to backhand the younger man across the face, sending him sprawling into the mud. "We don't retreat from a couple of runaway slaves, Morrison. We finish the job we were paid to do." Oh, but I could see the fear in Blackwood's eyes, the way his hand never strayed far from his pistol, the way he started at every sound from the surrounding swamp. He was beginning to understand that he wasn't the hunter anymore. He was the prey. That night, as the two men huddled around their campfire and tried to peer through the darkness that pressed in around them like a living thing, Malcolm and I prepared for our final assault. We had saved the best for last, planning something special for the man who had dared to hunt us like animals. Captain Ezra Blackwood was about to learn that some prey fights back, and when it does, the hunter becomes the hunted. The fog that night was thicker than I'd ever seen it, rolling in from the gulf like the breath of some enormous beast. It swallowed the swamp whole, turning familiar landmarks into alien shapes and muffling sound, until even our own breathing seemed unnaturally loud. Perfect hunting weather. Malcolm and I had spent the day preparing for what would be our most elaborate kill yet. My brother's transformation was now complete. The gentle soul who had once sung lullabies to comfort me had been replaced by something that seemed to feed on violence and fear. His body was covered in ritual scars, each one representing a life he'd taken, and his eyes held a predatory gleam that never seemed to fade. I was changing too, though I tried not to acknowledge it. The systematic killing had awakened something dark in my soul, something that whispered that our enemies deserved not just death, but suffering. The scared boy who had watched Lily die was gone, replaced by a creature that could inflict pain without remorse. Blackwood and Morrison had made their camp on a small island surrounded by deep water, thinking the natural barrier would protect them from attack. They'd built their fire in the center of the clearing and positioned themselves with clear sightlines in all directions. It was a textbook defensive position that should have been impregnable. But they had made one crucial mistake. They were thinking like soldiers, fighting other soldiers, not like men being hunted by predators who'd been born and raised in this swamp. "You take Morrison," Malcolm whispered, as we slipped through the water like alligators, our bodies coated with mud and plant matter that made us invisible in the darkness. "I want Blackwood for myself." The young lieutenant was the weaker of the two, both physically and mentally. The past few days had broken something inside him, and he sat by the fire with his rifle across his knees, jumping at every sound from the surrounding darkness. His hands shook as he tried to light a cigarette, and I could smell the fear sweat on him, even through the thick fog. Blackwood was made of sterner stuff, but even he was showing signs of strain. He sat with his back to a large cypress tree, his pistol drawn and ready, his eyes constantly scanning the perimeter of their small camp. But his attention was focused outward, watching for an attack from the water or the surrounding trees. He never thought to look up. I had learned to climb like a monkey during our weeks in the swamp, and the cypress trees were old friends that offered easy passage through their massive branches. I moved through the canopy like a shadow, positioning myself directly above Morrison while Malcolm approached Blackwood from the water. The attack began with psychological warfare. Malcolm started making sounds from the darkness, not quite human, not quite animal, but something that seemed to come from the deepest nightmares of both men. Low growls, scratching noises, the splash of something large moving through the water just beyond the edge of their vision. "What the hell is that?" Morrison whispered, his voice cracking with terror. "Just the swamp," Blackwood replied, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "Gators, maybe. Or a bear." But the sounds continued, growing closer and more frequent. Malcolm was circling their position like a predator, letting them know they were being hunted without revealing his exact location. The psychological pressure was enormous, and I watched both men begin to crack under the strain. Morrison broke first. A particularly loud splash from the darkness sent him jumping to his feet, his rifle swinging wildly as he tried to find a target. "There!" he shouted, firing blindly into the fog. "I saw something!" The muzzle flash illuminated nothing but empty water and Spanish moss, but it also destroyed their night vision and revealed their exact position. Malcolm had been waiting for exactly this moment. I dropped from the tree branch like a hunting spider, landing directly behind Morrison as he fumbled to reload his rifle. My plow iron slid between his ribs and into his heart before he could even turn around, but I didn't kill him immediately. Instead, I held him upright, using his body as a shield, while Malcolm emerged from the water like some primordial nightmare. My brother had decorated himself for this final hunt, covering his body with mud and Spanish moss until he looked more like a swamp creature than a human being. The ritual scars on his chest and arms seemed to glow in the firelight, and his eyes reflected the flames like a wild animal's. Blackwood fired 3 shots in rapid succession, but Morrison's body absorbed the bullets meant for me. The young lieutenant died with a gurgling scream, his blood spraying across the campfire and sending up clouds of hissing steam. "Come on then, you bastard!" Blackwood shouted, drawing his backup pistol as Malcolm advanced through the smoke and steam. "Let's finish this!" But Malcolm wasn't interested in a quick kill. He wanted Blackwood to suffer, to understand what it felt like to be hunted like an animal. He circled the fire like a predator, just close enough to be seen, but too far away for an accurate shot. "You came here to hunt slaves," Malcolm said, his voice carrying an inhuman quality that made my skin crawl. "But we ain't slaves anymore. We're something else now. Something you created with your whips and chains and casual cruelty." Blackwood fired again, but his hands were shaking too badly for accuracy. The bullet went wide, embedding itself in a cypress trunk with a solid thunk. "What are you?" Blackwood whispered, his professional composure finally cracking completely. "We're your judgment," Malcolm replied, lunging forward with his cotton hook gleaming in the firelight. The 2 men crashed together in a tangle of limbs and weapons, rolling across the muddy ground as they fought for their lives. Blackwood was larger and more experienced, but Malcolm fought with the desperate fury of a man who had nothing left to lose. The cotton hook opened a long gash across Blackwood's chest, but the former officer managed to grab Malcolm's wrist before he could strike again. They rolled toward the fire, sparks flying as their bodies disturbed the burning logs. I wanted to help, but this was Malcolm's fight. He needed to face Blackwood alone, to prove to himself that he could defeat the man who represented everything we were fighting against. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Both men were bleeding from multiple wounds, their clothes torn and muddy, their faces twisted with pain and determination. But gradually, Malcolm's youth and fury began to overcome Blackwood's experience and training. The end came when Blackwood made a desperate grab for his fallen pistol. Malcolm's cotton hook caught him in the throat, opening his carotid artery in a spray of crimson that painted the nearby trees. The former officer collapsed, his hands clutching uselessly at the wound as his life pumped out onto the muddy ground. But Malcolm wasn't finished. With methodical precision, he began carving symbols into Blackwood's chest, creating wounds that looked like the work of some enormous beast. But these cuts were different from the others, more elaborate, more artistic, as if my brother was developing his own twisted form of expression through violence. "Why are you doing that?" I asked, disturbed by the ritualistic nature of the mutilation. "Because they need to know," Malcolm replied, his voice eerily calm. "They need to understand that we're not just killing them. We're marking them, claiming them, making them part of something bigger." As he worked, I realized that my brother had crossed a line that I wasn't sure I could follow him across. The systematic violence was changing him into something that wasn't quite human anymore, something that seemed to feed on blood and fear. But I also understood that there was no going back. We had started down this path when we watched Lily die, and we would follow it to its inevitable conclusion, no matter where it led us. When Malcolm finished his work, we arranged the bodies in a grotesque tableau that would haunt the nightmares of anyone who found them. Then we melted back into the swamp, leaving behind another message for those who profited from human suffering. 8 more bodies added to our count, 8 more souls sent to whatever judgment awaited them. But as we disappeared into the fog-shrouded darkness, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were losing something essential with each kill. The righteous anger that had driven us to seek justice was slowly being replaced by something darker, something that whispered that our enemies deserved not just death, but torment. The line between justice and vengeance was blurring, and I wasn't sure we could find our way back to the light, but in the morning there would be more hunting to do. The news of Blackwood's death spread through the parish like wildfire, carried by the lone survivor who had discovered the grotesque scene 3 days later. The man, a local guide who had been hired to lead a search party, emerged from the swamp babbling about demons and creatures from hell that had torn apart the professional slave hunters like they were children. The newspapers called it the Bayou Massacre, and the sensationalized accounts grew more lurid with each retelling. Some claimed the bodies had been found arranged in occult patterns. Others whispered about strange symbols carved into the trees around the campsite. The truth was both simpler and more terrifying than any of the wild theories circulating through Louisiana society. We had sent a message, and that message had been received. Plantation owners throughout the region began abandoning their properties, taking their families and whatever wealth they could carry, and fleeing to the safety of New Orleans or Mobile. Those who remained hired small armies of guards and built their houses into virtual fortresses, surrounding themselves with high walls and armed men. But Master Beauregard was too proud and too stubborn to run. "I'll be damned if I let a couple of runaway slaves drive me from my own land," I heard him tell his remaining overseers during one of our nighttime reconnaissance missions. "This plantation has been in my family for 3 generations, and it'll take more than a pair of swamp rats to make me abandon it." His defiance would prove to be a fatal mistake. Malcolm had been planning something special for the Beauregard plantation, not just another killing, but a complete purification that would erase the stain of slavery from the land where we had suffered for so many years. He called it our final judgment, and the ritualistic way he spoke about it made my skin crawl. My brother had changed dramatically over the past months. The systematic violence had transformed him into something that was barely recognizable as the gentle soul who had once protected me from the worst of the overseer's cruelty. His body was covered in ritual scars, each one representing a life he had taken, and his eyes held a predatory gleam that never seemed to fade. He had also begun talking to himself, or rather, to something that only he could see. I would catch him having whispered conversations with empty air, nodding as if receiving instructions from some invisible presence. When I asked him about it, he would just smile and say that they were guiding him toward his true purpose. I was changing too, though I tried not to acknowledge it. The constant killing had awakened something dark in my soul, something that whispered that our enemies deserved not just death, but suffering. The scared boy who had watched Lily die was gone, replaced by a creature that could inflict pain without remorse. But unlike Malcolm, I still retained enough of my humanity to be disturbed by what we were becoming. The attack on the Beauregard plantation began at midnight on a moonless night when the fog rolled in thick from the Gulf. We had spent weeks preparing, studying the guards' routines, identifying weak points in their defenses, and gathering the materials we would need for what Malcolm called our cleansing fire. The plantation now employed 12 guards working in shifts, all of them armed with rifles and positioned at strategic points around the property. They had built watchtowers at the corners of the main house and installed oil lamps that kept the immediate area well lit throughout the night. But they had made the same mistake as Blackwood. They were thinking like soldiers, defending against other soldiers, not like men trying to stop predators who had been born and raised on this very land. We knew every inch of the plantation, every hiding spot, every secret passage that the guards had never discovered. We had grown up here, suffered here, and now we would cleanse it with fire and blood. The first guard died without ever knowing we were there. He was stationed in the tobacco barn, smoking a pipe and reading a newspaper by lamplight. Malcolm's cotton hook opened his throat as he turned a page, sending blood spraying across the headlines about the bayou demons that were terrorizing the region. The second guard was patrolling the perimeter when I found him. My plow iron slid between his ribs and into his heart as he stopped to light a cigarette, and he died, with the unlit tobacco still between his lips. But this time, we didn't just kill the guards and leave. Malcolm had prepared something special for this final assault, containers of lamp oil that we had stolen from abandoned plantations, along with bundles of dry Spanish moss that would burn like tinder. "Tonight, we purify this place," Malcolm whispered as we moved through the darkness like avenging angels. "Tonight, we wash away the stain of slavery with cleansing fire." The slave quarters were our first target. The wooden buildings, where we had suffered for so many years, went up like torches, the dry timber crackling and popping as the flames consumed decades of human misery. But we made sure the buildings were empty first. The few remaining slaves had been moved to the main house for protection, though we all knew it was really to prevent them from escaping during the chaos. The tobacco barn was next, then the cotton gin, then the stables. Each building erupted in flames that reached toward the sky like prayers for justice, casting dancing shadows across the plantation grounds and turning night into day. The guards finally realized what was happening when the overseer quarters caught fire. They came running from their posts, shouting orders and firing blindly into the darkness, but we were already gone, melted back into the shadows like the demons they believed us to be. Master Beauregard emerged from his house in his nightclothes, his face twisted with rage and disbelief as he watched his life's work burn around him. "Find them!" he screamed at his remaining guards. "Find them and bring me their heads!" But his men were too terrified to venture far from the main house. They had heard the stories about the bayou demons, seen the mutilated bodies of those who had tried to hunt us. They formed a defensive circle around their employer and waited for dawn, hoping that daylight would drive away the nightmare that had descended upon them. They were wrong. As the plantation burned around us, Malcolm and I began our final assault on the main house. We moved like shadows through the smoke and flames, using the chaos and confusion to mask our approach. The guards were so focused on watching the perimeter that they never thought to look up. I climbed to the second-floor balcony while Malcolm entered through the kitchen. The plan was simple: drive the guards and Master Beauregard toward the center of the house, then trap them there while the building burned around them. The first guard I encountered was standing at a window, watching the fires consume the outbuildings. He never heard me coming. My plow iron punched through the base of his skull and into his brain, killing him instantly. His body slumped against the window frame, blood running down the glass like rain. Malcolm was working his way through the ground floor, and I could hear the screams and gunshots that marked his passage. He wasn't trying to be subtle anymore. This was about terror, about making our enemies understand what it felt like to be hunted like animals. Master Beauregard had barricaded himself in his study with his remaining guards, but the wooden door wouldn't hold us for long. Malcolm kicked it open with inhuman strength, his cotton hook gleaming in the lamplight as he advanced on the men who had made our lives a living hell. "Please," Beauregard whimpered, his aristocratic composure finally cracking completely. "I'll give you anything. Money, freedom, whatever you want." "We already took our freedom," Malcolm replied, his voice carrying an inhuman quality that made my skin crawl. "Now we're here for justice." The final battle was brief but brutal. The guards fought with the desperation of cornered animals, but they were no match for opponents who had been forged in the fires of systematic oppression. One by one, they fell to our weapons, their blood painting the expensive wallpaper and Persian rugs. Master Beauregard was the last to die, and Malcolm made sure his death was neither quick nor merciful. The cotton hook opened wounds that bled freely but didn't immediately kill, and my brother took his time carving the ritual symbols that had become his signature. "This is for Lily," Malcolm whispered as he worked. "This is for Samuel. This is for Marcus. This is for every soul that suffered and died on this cursed land." When it was over, we stood in a house painted red with blood and surrounded by cleansing fire. The plantation that had been our prison for so many years was being consumed by flames that reached toward the sky like prayers for justice. But as we prepared to leave, I realized that something fundamental had changed in my brother. The systematic violence had transformed him into something that was no longer quite human, something that seemed to feed on blood and fear. "What happens now?" I asked, as we watched the main house begin to burn. Malcolm smiled, and in that expression I saw something that chilled me to the bone. "Now we find the others," he said. "Every plantation owner, every overseer, every slave trader in Louisiana. We cleanse them all." As we disappeared into the smoke-filled darkness, leaving behind a scene that would haunt the region for generations, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had crossed a line from which there could be no return. The scared boy who had watched Lily die was gone forever, replaced by something darker and more dangerous than anything the plantation owners could possibly imagine. And there were still more souls to claim before our work was done. 6 months had passed since the burning of the Beauregard plantation, and our legend had grown beyond anything I could have imagined. The newspapers called us everything from the Bayou Demons to the Shadow Brothers, and our body count had reached 43 confirmed kills, with dozens more missing persons attributed to our activities. But the systematic violence was taking its toll on both of us, though in different ways. Malcolm had become something that was barely recognizable as human. His body was covered in ritual scars, each one representing a life he had taken, and his conversations with invisible presences had become more frequent and more disturbing. He spoke of cleansing the entire South and purifying the land with blood and fire, his eyes holding a fanatical gleam that never seemed to fade. I was changing too, but unlike my brother, I still retained enough of my humanity to be horrified by what we were becoming. The constant killing had awakened something dark in my soul, but it hadn't completely consumed me the way it had consumed Malcolm. The breaking point came when we encountered a small plantation outside of Baton Rouge, where the owner, a man named Caldwell, had actually treated his slaves with something approaching decency. The living conditions were clean, the work was hard but not brutal, and there were no reports of systematic torture or murder. But Malcolm didn't care about such distinctions anymore. "They're all guilty," he said, as we watched the plantation from our hiding spot in the nearby woods. "Every single one of them profits from human bondage. They all deserve to burn." "But these people aren't like Beauregard," I protested. "They're not monsters, they're slaveholders," Malcolm interrupted, his voice carrying that inhuman quality that had become his trademark. "That's all that matters." That night, as Malcolm prepared to launch another assault, I made a decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. I couldn't stop my brother from his path of destruction, but I couldn't be part of indiscriminate slaughter either. I left him there in the darkness, slipping away into the swamp while he planned his attack on people whose only crime was being born into a system they hadn't created. It was the hardest thing I'd ever done, abandoning the brother who had protected me for so many years, but I couldn't watch him become the very monster we had originally fought against. The next morning, I heard the gunshots echoing across the water, not the systematic executions that had become our trademark, but the chaotic sounds of a desperate battle. Malcolm had attacked the plantation alone, and Caldwell's guards had been ready for him. When I finally worked up the courage to investigate, I found a scene that would be burned into my memory forever. Malcolm had killed 6 men before they brought him down, but the cost had been enormous. His body was riddled with bullet holes, his blood mixing with the Louisiana mud to create patterns that looked almost artistic in the morning light. But even in death, he had managed one final act of defiance. The ritual scars he had carved into his own body formed a message that was clearly visible to anyone who found him. Symbols that spoke of judgment, purification, and the price of human bondage. The authorities found 47 bodies that could be definitively attributed to our campaign of vengeance, though the true number was probably higher. Some victims had simply disappeared into the swamp, their bodies never recovered, their fates known only to the alligators and the Spanish moss. I survived by disappearing completely, using skills learned during our months as fugitives to vanish into the vast network of runaway slaves, free blacks, and abolitionists who operated throughout the South. I changed my name, altered my appearance, and never spoke of what my brother and I had done during that terrible year. But the legend lived on. For decades afterward, plantation owners throughout Louisiana would wake up screaming from nightmares about the Shadow Brothers. Children would be warned not to venture into the swamp after dark, lest they encounter the spirits of Josiah and Malcolm, still hunting for those who profited from human suffering. Some claim to have seen us in the mist-shrouded bayous, moving through the Spanish moss like avenging angels. Others whispered about strange symbols carved into trees, ritual markings that suggested we were still out there, still watching, still waiting for the right moment to strike. The truth was both simpler and more complex than any of the legends that grew up around our story. We had been 2 young men pushed beyond the breaking point by systematic cruelty, transformed by violence into something that could fight back against the machine of oppression. But in fighting monsters, we had become monsters ourselves. Malcolm had lost himself completely to the darkness, consumed by a righteous fury that eventually became indistinguishable from madness. I had managed to pull back from that edge, but not before participating in acts of violence that would haunt me for the rest of my life. Years later, when the Civil War finally came and the institution of slavery was abolished, I wondered if our campaign of terror had contributed in some small way to that eventual victory. Had our actions helped convince some plantation owners that the system was unsustainable? Had the fear we spread made it easier for other slaves to escape or rebel? I'll never know for certain, but I like to think that Samuel, Marcus, and Lily would have understood what we did in their memory. We had taken their deaths and transformed them into something that struck fear into the hearts of those who saw human beings as property. The 47 souls we claimed during that terrible year were just a fraction of the thousands who died in bondage throughout the South. But for one brief, violent period, the hunters became the hunted, and those who profited from human suffering learned what it felt like to live in fear. As I write these words in my old age, far from the Louisiana bayou where my brother and I became legends, I can still hear Malcolm's voice echoing across the water. Sometimes it's the gentle soul who sang me to sleep during the worst nights of our captivity, but more often it's the inhuman thing he became, whispering about purification and judgment and the price of human bondage. The Shadow Brothers are gone now, claimed by time and violence and the inexorable march of history. But the legend lives on, carried by the wind through the Spanish moss, whispered in the darkness by those who remember that sometimes, when the system becomes too cruel to bear, ordinary people transform into something extraordinary, something terrible, something necessary. And in the deepest, darkest corners of the Louisiana swamp, where the mist rolls in thick from the Gulf and the cypress trees stand like ancient sentinels, some say you can still hear the sound of our footsteps in the mud, still see the gleam of sharpened metal in the moonlight, still hunting, still judging, still claiming the souls of those who profit from human suffering. The count stopped at 47, but the legend will never die. Because some stories are too powerful to be buried, too important to be forgotten, and too terrifying to be anything but true. This is the story of the Shadow Brothers, told by the only man who lived to remember what we really were. Not demons or monsters, but two young men who refused to die quietly in the darkness. And sometimes, that refusal to surrender is the most terrifying thing of all. 50 years have passed since that terrible year in the Louisiana bayou, and I am now an old man, living under an assumed name in a small town far from the scenes of our violence. The Civil War came and went, slavery was abolished, and the world moved on to new horrors and new injustices. But the legend of the Shadow Brothers refuses to die. Just last week, a young journalist from New Orleans came to interview me about local folklore and legends of the antebellum period. He had no idea he was speaking to one of the very demons he was researching, and I kept my secrets locked away behind the weathered face of a harmless old man. "Tell me about the bayou demons," he said, his pencil poised over his notebook. "Do you think there's any truth to the stories?" I looked out the window at the peaceful street, watching children play in the afternoon sunlight, and I thought about Lily's screams, Samuel's blood, Marcus's final breath. I thought about my brother's transformation from protector to predator, and about the 47 souls we claimed in the name of justice. "Some stories," I told the young man, "are too terrible to be anything but true." He pressed me for details, but I gave him only the sanitized version that had been passed down through generations of storytellers. I spoke of mysterious disappearances and unexplained deaths, of strange symbols carved into cypress trees and bodies found mutilated beyond recognition. I didn't tell him about the weight of the cotton hook in my brother's hand, or the sound a man makes when his throat is opened by sharpened metal. I didn't describe the ritual scars that covered Malcolm's body, or the inhuman gleam that had replaced the gentle soul behind his eyes. Some truths are too heavy for the living to bear. After the journalist left, I sat alone in my small parlor and opened the wooden box where I keep my most precious possessions. Inside, wrapped in faded cloth, is the plow iron that served as my weapon during those terrible months. The metal is still stained with rust that might be blood, and sometimes, in the quiet hours before dawn, I swear I can still feel the weight of it in my hand. Next to the weapon is a small piece of Spanish moss that I took from the tree where we hung the Hutchins brothers. It's dry and brittle now, but it still carries the scent of the bayou, still whispers of mist-shrouded nights, and the sound of our footsteps in the mud. And at the bottom of the box, carefully preserved between sheets of glass, is a newspaper clipping from 1845. The headline reads, "Bayou Demons Claim Final Victims. Reign of Terror Ends with Death of Mysterious Killers." And Dune. The article describes the discovery of Malcolm's body and speculates about the identity of his accomplice, who was never found. It mentions the 47 confirmed deaths and suggests that the creatures responsible were likely escaped slaves driven mad by their treatment. They were closer to the truth than they knew. Sometimes, late at night when the wind is blowing just right, I can hear my brother's voice calling to me across the years. Not the monster he became, but the gentle soul who protected me during the darkest days of our captivity. He's asking me to join him, to take up the cotton hook once more and continue the work we started. But I'm too old now, too tired, and perhaps too wise to answer that call. The world has moved on, and the particular evil we fought against has been replaced by new forms of injustice that require different kinds of warriors. Yet I know that somewhere in the Louisiana bayou, in the mist-shrouded channels between the cypress trees, the legend of the Shadow Brothers continues to grow. New stories are added with each telling. New details emerge from the collective imagination of a people who understand that sometimes, when the system becomes too cruel to bear, Ordinary men must become extraordinary. Children still dare each other to venture into the swamp after dark, hoping to catch a glimpse of the demons who once terrorized the plantation owners. Historians debate whether we were real or mythical, heroes or villains, freedom fighters or simple murderers. The truth, as always, is more complex than any of them imagine. We were two young men who watched innocents die and decided that silence was complicity. We were products of a system so brutal that it created its own destroyers. We were the nightmare that slaveholders brought upon themselves through their casual cruelty and systematic dehumanization. And in the end, we were exactly what we needed to be. A reminder that every action has consequences, that every injustice creates its own response, and that sometimes the oppressed become the oppressor's worst nightmare. The count remains at 47, frozen in time like the Spanish moss in my wooden box. But the legend grows stronger with each passing year, fed by the collective memory of those who understand that some stories are too important to die. Because in a world where the powerful prey upon the weak, where human beings are treated as property, where children watch their families destroyed by systematic cruelty, there must always be the possibility that somewhere in the darkness, justice is waiting, watching, hunting, ready to claim the souls of those who profit from human suffering. This is the true story of the Shadow Brothers, told by the last man who remembers what we really were. Not demons or monsters, but two young men who refused to die quietly in the darkness. And perhaps, in a world that still struggles with injustice and oppression, that refusal to surrender is the most important lesson of all. The bayou keeps its secrets, but some truths are too powerful to remain buried forever. 47 souls claimed in the name of justice, one legend that will never die. And somewhere in the mist-shrouded darkness of the Louisiana swamp, the Shadow Brothers are still hunting, still waiting, still watching for those who would profit from human suffering, because some debts can never be fully paid, and some stories are too terrible and too necessary to ever truly end.